Happy Thursday, class. In honor of Women's History Month, today we're going to be highlighting the many contributions Black women have made to the fight for civil liberties and how their labor has shaped the very framework of American democracy. Throughout American history, Black women have been central to the fight for justice, challenging unjust laws, shaping constitutional interpretation, and driving the broader struggle for civil rights. Yet despite their critical role, their contributions have often been overshadowed or overlooked altogether. Today we examine the intersection of race, gender, and legal advocacy through the lens of Black feminism, the constitutional battles waged by Black women, and the legacies of figures like Rosa Parks, Fannie Lou Hamer, and Pauli Murray. By the end of this discussion, one thing will be clear. Black women have not only participated in movements for justice, they have defined them. To understand how Black women have shaped constitutional law, we must first recognize that their advocacy has always existed at the intersection of race and gender. Black feminism, distinct from mainstream feminism, emerged out of necessity because neither white feminist movements nor mainstream civil rights activism fully addressed the unique struggles that Black women face. Legal scholar and activist Pauli Murray exemplified this intersectional approach. Her work laid the foundation for gender equality cases, directly influencing Supreme Court decisions like Reed v. Reed, the first case to strike down a law based on gender discrimination under the Equal Protection Clause. Murray also challenged the exclusion of Black women from full participation in democracy, setting the stage for legal battles that extended beyond gender to include voting rights, education, and labor protections. Her work also influenced Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who cited Murray's arguments in her own legal battles for gender equality. This is a reminder that constitutional law is not static. It evolves through advocacy, scholarship, and crucially, the persistent demands of those whom the law has historically failed. Black women have been at the forefront of that evolution, yet their names are often left out of the dominant narratives. Ida B. Wells was one of the earliest and most fearless advocates for constitutional justice. As a journalist, she documented the epidemic of racial terror lynchings in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, exposing how state and federal governments failed to uphold the constitutional rights of Black Americans. Her work was not just about awareness. It was a legal and moral challenge to the government's failure to enforce the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. Wells's advocacy led her to the Supreme Court case Railroad Company v. Wells, where she sued for being forcibly removed from a first-class train car despite holding a ticket. Though she initially won, the decision was later overturned on appeal, foreshadowing the legal battles against segregation that would come decades later. Her relentless fight against racial injustice paved the way for future civil rights litigation, proving that investigative journalism can be a form of legal advocacy. Rosa Parks is often reduced to a passive figure who refused to give up her seat on a bus, but her activism was far more extensive. Long before the Montgomery Bus Boycott, Parks was an NAACP investigator, working on cases of racial and sexual violence against Black women. One such case was that of Reese Taylor, a Black woman kidnapped and assaulted by 6 white men in 1944. Parks's advocacy brought national attention to the case, though the men were never convicted. These legal battles, where Black women's bodies became sites of both racial and gendered oppression, illustrate how constitutional protections often failed them. Yet it was Black women like Parks who persisted, challenging segregation laws and laying the groundwork for victories like Browder v. Gale, which ruled that bus segregation was unconstitutional. This case was about far more than public transportation. It was about dismantling the legal structures that upheld racial hierarchy. Few figures embody the fight for constitutional rights as powerfully as Fannie Lou Hamer. Born into a sharecropping family, she became one of the most influential voices of the voting rights movement, directly challenging the constitutionality of voter suppression. In 1964, Hamer co-founded the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party to contest the legitimacy of Mississippi's all-white Democratic delegation at the Democratic National Convention. Her testimony before the Credentials Committee exposed the brutal reality of Black voter suppression, detailing how she was arrested and beaten simply for trying to exercise her right to vote. Hamer's activism helped lead to the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, reinforcing constitutional protections under the 15th Amendment. Yet the recent dismantling of key provisions of this act in Shelby County v. Holder shows that the fight she started is far from over. Black women have long fought for constitutional protections that extend beyond themselves. Consider Mildred Loving, the Black woman whose marriage to a white man led to the Supreme Court's landmark decision in Loving v. Virginia, striking down laws banning interracial marriage. These cases demonstrate a broader truth. Black women have often been the ones to push constitutional law forward, yet their contributions are rarely recognized. This brings us to the work of Professor Patricia Broussard, who explores the historical silencing of Black women and its implications for legal and social justice. In her article, Unbowed, Unbroken, and Unsung, Professor Broussard argues that Black women's contributions to law and civil rights are often erased from history, even though their activism has been pivotal in shaping constitutional jurisprudence. In her second article, Black Women's Post-Slavery Silence Syndrome, she examines how historical trauma has conditioned Black women to endure violence and systemic oppression in silence. This silence, she argues, is not a sign of passivity. It is a survival strategy born out of centuries of exclusion from legal protections. Broussard challenges us to confront this history and to recognize that the 14th and 15th Amendments must be measured not just in legal theory, but in the lived experiences of those who have been denied their full protection. The fight for justice is not history. It's happening right now. Black women continue to challenge discriminatory laws, advocate for voting rights, and push for policies that recognize and address racialized gender violence. The question is not whether Black women will continue to lead, it's whether the rest of society will listen. So here's my challenge to you. How will you help amplify the voices of Black women in law, policy, and activism? How will you support the legal and political battles still being waged? And most importantly, how can we work toward a system that fully embodies the constitutional principles of justice and equality? Because constitutional law is not just shaped in courtrooms, it's shaped in our collective actions. The contributions of Black women must not be footnotes. They must be foundational to our understanding of justice in America. It's time to ensure that their legacies are recognized, not as afterthoughts, but as central to the very fabric of our democracy.